Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a time when the highest court in the land declared that racial segregation was not just acceptable, but constitutional. Plessy v. Ferguson legalized inequality, turning separate but equal into a legal doctrine that would shape America for over half a century. But what if I told you that this decision didn't just change laws, it changed lives, setting the stage for one of the most intense battles for civil rights in history? Stay with me as we explore how this landmark case carved a deep divide in America and sparked a movement that would not only challenge the law, but ultimately dismantle a system of racial injustice. And in 1896, the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson marked a pivotal moment in American legal history, establishing the constitutionality of racial segregation. The case stemmed from Homer Plessy's deliberate arrest for sitting in a whites-only railroad car challenging Louisiana's segregation laws. Plessy argued that these laws violated the 13th and 14th Amendments, which prohibited slavery and guaranteed equal protection under the law. However, the Supreme Court in a 7-1 decision ruled against Plessy, affirming this separate but equal doctrine. Justice Henry Billings Brown, writing the majority opinion, stated that racial segregation did not in itself constitute unlawful discrimination as long as the separate facilities provided were equal in quality. This ruling entrenched a legal justification for the segregation of public facilities, transportation, schools, and other areas of life for African Americans, even though in practice the segregated facilities were often far from equal. The decision was met with widespread approval in the southern states, where segregation laws were already firmly in place, but it drew fierce criticism from civil rights advocates who saw it as an endorsement of racial inequality. The Plessy ruling would stand for over half a century, laying the foundation for an institutionalized system of racial discrimination, until it was eventually overturned by Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. However, the enduring impact of Plessy v. Ferguson cannot be understated, as it symbolized the legal entrenchment of racial segregation in the United States, reinforcing the social and political divide that would persist for decades to come. And as time passed, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision deepened the systemic racial divide in the United States, providing a legal framework for segregation that affected every aspect of daily life for African Americans. The ruling didn't just apply to transportation. It reverberated throughout schools, restaurants, restrooms, and public spaces, all of which were segregated under the guise of providing separate but equal accommodations. This precedent helped institutionalize the idea that African Americans were inherently inferior, reinforcing racial hierarchies that shaped the nation's social, economic, and political systems. While some argued that the ruling would bring about harmony and order, it instead entrenched division and reinforced a sense of second-class citizenship for millions of Black Americans. The decision was a clear indication that the Supreme Court was willing to perpetuate the status quo of racial inequality, leaving many African Americans to confront the harsh reality of a society that viewed them as separate, unequal, and inferior. And in the years that followed, the Plessy decision became a tool for segregationists who were determined to maintain their power and control over African Americans. The ruling provided a veneer of legal justification for policies that perpetuated the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, from the poll taxes and literacy tests that kept them from voting to an equal education system that denied them access to quality schooling. It wasn't just the physical segregation of spaces that was harmful. It was the psychological toll that this separation took on African Americans, who were told through both law and culture that they were not equal to their white counterparts. This sense of inferiority, often internalized, became a powerful barrier to progress, limiting opportunities and aspirations for generations of Black Americans. And yet, even in the face of such adversity, the Plessy decision sparked a movement of resistance. Civil rights activists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who were determined to challenge the entrenched racial order began to push back against the legal framework that had been laid by Plessy. It was within this context that leaders like W. E. B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and others began to advocate for a more just society, using both legal and social means to challenge the prevailing norms. The activism and resistance in the face of legalized segregation were not merely acts of defiance. They were declarations of equality, asserting that Black Americans were deserving of the same rights and dignity as any other citizen. And the Plessy case became a symbol of the legal and moral failures of a nation that promised liberty and justice for all but fell short of delivering on that promise for its African American citizens. While the case institutionalized segregation for decades, it also galvanized efforts that eventually led to landmark victories in the civil rights movement. Over time, the nation's conscience was awakened, and the persistence of activists combined with growing public awareness helped shift public opinion on the issue of segregation. The moral and legal challenges to Plessy would eventually culminate in the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared that segregation in public schools was inherently unequal, thus overturning Plessy's separate but equal doctrine. And however, the journey toward equality was far from over. The Plessy case, despite being overturned, left behind a legacy of legal, social, and economic inequalities that would take years to address. Yet the resistance to Plessy and the movement it inspired proved that the fight for justice and equality is never easy, and progress often comes in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a reminder that the law, while a tool of oppression in some instances, can also be a catalyst for change when wielded by those who are committed to justice, equality, and the betterment of society. As a whole, the resilience shown in challenging Plessy v. Ferguson is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the unyielding quest for dignity and freedom. And the impact of Plessy v. Ferguson extended far beyond the confines of legal precedent. It seeped into the fabric of American life, solidifying racial separation as an unquestioned norm. For decades, its decision permeated every aspect of the African American experience, particularly in the southern states, where segregation was most vehemently enforced. Under the guise of providing separate but equal facilities, the ruling perpetuated the myth of racial superiority while simultaneously undermining the very essence of equality and justice that the Constitution promised. The disparity between the so-called separate facilities was stark. The educational institutions for African Americans were severely underfunded, the public spaces were dilapidated, and the opportunities for advancement were non-existent in comparison to those offered to white citizens. Yet the ruling ensured that these inequalities were not merely societal, but legally sanctioned, allowing segregationists to justify their practices as constitutional under the law. And while African Americans faced legalized inequality in every sector of society, the Plessy decision also stifled any hope for political equality. The disenfranchisement of Black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other exclusionary tactics was underpinned by the legal framework established in Plessy. By allowing segregation to be deemed acceptable under the Constitution, the case lent legal legitimacy to a system of racial exclusion that sought to limit the political and social mobility of African Americans. For years, any challenge to the system was met with the assertion of Plessy's separate but equal doctrine, which created a near impenetrable barrier for those advocating for change. The legal and political environment was one that made it nearly impossible for African Americans to assert their rights fully, effectively relegating them to second-class citizenship. And however, this period of stagnation was not without its resistance. As the decades wore on, and as the plight of African Americans became more widely known, the moral and legal challenges to Plessy began to gain traction. It was in this climate of resistance that the civil rights movement began to take shape, spearheaded by legal scholars, activists, and everyday citizens who refused to accept the legal and moral implications of segregation. They understood that Plessy had entrenched a system that denied Black Americans their fundamental rights, and they were determined to overturn it. Organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, became the driving force behind challenging segregation, bringing cases to court that would chip away at the foundation established by Plessy, and one of the most notable victories in this fight was the case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which directly challenged the Plessy decision. In this landmark ruling, the Supreme Court declared that segregation in public schools was inherently unequal, thus invalidating this separate but equal doctrine for the first time. The Brown case represented a monumental shift in the judicial mindset, as it rejected the idea that segregation could ever be truly equal and acknowledged the deep psychological harm that segregation inflicted upon Black children. This decision was not just a legal victory, but a moral one that acknowledged the inherent injustice of Plessy. It marked the beginning of the dismantling of segregation, though the journey toward full equality remained long and difficult. And despite the landmark nature of Brown, the influence of Plessy remained for years, as the ruling had deeply embedded the principle of segregation into the nation's legal and cultural landscape. The fight against segregation required not only legal victories, but also a radical shift in public perception. The legacy of Plessy remained visible in the long struggle for civil rights, as activists continued to push for laws that would ensure true equality under the law. Though the Plessy case had long outlived its usefulness as a tool of segregation, its legacy endured in the hearts and minds of those who sought to resist it, and in the structures that still held many African Americans in subjugation. This long, arduous battle would eventually lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, key milestones in the quest to ensure that all Americans could enjoy the freedoms and opportunities promised by the Constitution, irrespective of race or ethnicity. These victories, however, were not the end of the fight, but rather a chapter in the ongoing struggle for racial justice, one that continues to unfold to this day. And the Plessy decision, while legally dismantled in some respects, left behind a pervasive cultural and social legacy that lingered for decades. It created an enduring notion of racial separation that influenced not only legal frameworks, but also the deeply entrenched racial attitudes and prejudices within American society. Even after the legal victories of the civil rights movement, including the passage of landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the social impact of Plessy was far-reaching. It took years of concerted effort both inside and outside the courtroom to begin addressing the broader consequences of this legalized segregation, which had created significant gaps in wealth, education, and social status between African Americans and white Americans. The systemic inequalities that Plessy helped foster did not disappear overnight. Rather, they evolved, manifesting in more covert forms of discrimination that continued to hinder the progress of Black Americans, and one of the most significant aspects of Plessy v. Ferguson was the way it shaped the interpretation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. For decades, the court's adherence to the separate but equal doctrine under Plessy set a precedent that stymied efforts to guarantee equal treatment for all citizens, particularly for those who were marginalized by racial divisions. The enduring effect of this case was that it entrenched a framework where racial inequality was seen as a natural and, in some cases, legally acceptable condition. The government, through its laws and policies, perpetuated this racial divide, leaving African Americans and other minorities to fight for their rights through a variety of means, including legal challenges, protests, and social movements. It was not just the presence of legal segregation, but the cultural sanctioning of inequality that Plessy instilled in the fabric of American life. And the Plessy ruling, while legally overturned by Brown v. Board of Education and other subsequent decisions, continued to influence the legal thinking and the judicial climate of the era. Judges, lawmakers, and even law enforcement officers who were raised in a system that viewed racial separation as acceptable took time to reconsider these ingrained beliefs. The Plessy case had not only made segregation a legally sanctioned practice, but had embedded it into the everyday experiences of millions of Americans. It required years of social and political upheaval to break the shackles of Plessy's lasting impact. As such, even after the official legal challenges to segregation were won, the broader societal change that was necessary to ensure true equality still faced significant opposition, particularly in Southern states where segregation was most entrenched. And moreover, the societal effects of Plessy extended beyond the confines of public spaces, schools, and transportation. The case had a profound impact on African American culture and identity, shaping how Black Americans viewed their place in society. For many, Plessy symbolized the harsh reality of exclusion and dehumanization, a reminder that the legal system could at times become a tool of oppression rather than a force for justice. Yet, despite these overwhelming barriers, Plessy also acted as a catalyst for the development of a strong civil rights movement. The legal framework it established was not easily ignored, but it galvanized a generation of activists who were determined to challenge and ultimately dismantle the system of segregation. It was through their efforts that the foundations for a more just and equal society were laid, even as the broader battle for civil rights and racial equality continued to unfold across the 20th century. And while the legal victories achieved through the civil rights movement represented a significant step toward eradicating institutionalized racism, the enduring influence of Plessy served as a stark reminder that the path to equality is often long and fraught with obstacles. Plessy v. Ferguson had for a time codified racial separation, but it also inadvertently sowed the seeds for a robust challenge to racial injustice. The struggle against segregation and inequality, while not over, would continue to be informed by the lessons learned from Plessy, that the fight for equality is not merely a legal battle, but one that requires a transformation of societal attitudes, cultural norms, and ultimately a deeper commitment to ensuring that all individuals are treated with dignity and respect under the law. The legacy of Plessy serves as both a warning and a call to action, that laws, though powerful, can only reflect the will of a society that is willing to confront its most entrenched injustices. The ultimate triumph over Plessy was not just a legal victory, but a victory for the fundamental principles of justice, fairness, and equality for all.